Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Jane Wales.
Good morning. I don't know about you, but I found trying to go to bed right after a conversation about hate is a little bit hard, but I thought it was just a marvelous panel. I learned so much from it. So welcome to day 2. I get to do this morning what gives me a tremendous pleasure, and that is to introduce someone who has become a colleague of mine at the Aspen Institute, and that's David Brooks. Now, of course, long before he created a program at Aspen, we all knew his thinking and followed his thinking closely in reading his column in the New York Times, and of course his commentary on the NewsHour, which to just reveal my age, you know, I still think of it as the Jim Lehrer NewsHour. So what he has been doing for the last, gosh, I don't know how long it has been, David, but he came to the Institute with the idea of immersing himself in the world of social change and coming to understand the various agents of change that exist in communities around our country. And he refers to them as community builders. These are people who acknowledge really hard problems at the local level, reach out to build relationships with others who can work to address that problem, you know, operate on the understanding that sort of interdependence in a community is inescapable and, in fact, a benefit. And so he'll be reporting to us a little bit on what he has found as he's traveled the country and gotten to know these community builders. The name of his project is Weave the Social Fabric. Let me make sure I've got it right. It's called Weave the Social Fabric Project, and what we're hoping is that it will last for a very long time. That is not only an inquiry, but a means by which to spark action. Before I turn to David, though, I wanted to give a shout out to his wife and partner, Ann Snyder. Ann is at the Philanthropy Roundtable, which is a frequent partner of ours, but she's also an author in her own right. And just to give you a sense of whether she and her spouse are kind of on the same track, the name of her recent book is The Fabric of Character, A Wise Giver's Guide to Supporting Social and Moral Renewal. So I think they get to compare notes when they get home in the day. After David speaks to us and gives us a sense of what he's learned, we're then going to invite Dan Cardinali, who heads up independent sector, and Stern, who heads up the Houston Endowment, and ask them to come and join and again address a very similar question of where are the problems being solved, by whom, and for how long. David.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jane. I'm sorry I missed the hate panel. I'm more temperamentally suited to that one than to the love panel we're going to have today. I am the last person who should be doing a project on community because I'm a rather bookish and solitary person by nature. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I've written pretty much every day, and it's a solitary activity, and it's been the center of my life. I remember when in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy, and I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so that's where my life was. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which was also a solitary, bookish place, famously where fun goes to die. The best thing about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so that's, and I had a double major there in history and celibacy, which also kept me by myself. And then I went off and did a bookish sort of solitary life. I'm a pundit. I write a conservative column for the New York Times, which is a job I like in being the chief rabbi at Mecca. And then I have this show on Friday nights on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. We have a segment called Shields and Brooks on the NewsHour. And it's also, for TV, it's the bookish version of TV, and we cater to a certain demographic. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so I live in my head, but try to be a little more emotional. I'm the only American man to finish that book, Eat, Pray, Love. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote a book on character a few years ago called Road to Character. And I learned writing that book that writing a book on character doesn't actually give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character, and so I recommend it. All that is to say, I'm solitary. Writing is a lonely activity. It's a solitary activity. And if you succeed, it's weirdly more solitary. My last book did reasonably well, so I was on book tour for 99 days. And I counted 42 meals in a row that I ate alone at an airport, airplane, or hotel. And so I got completely unmoored from community. And I remember at about that time, Britney Spears went berserk and shaved off all her hair. And I was like, yeah, I get that. I could do that. And so I was in this culture of solitude. But I'm not alone in a culture of solitude. We live in a society that actually does isolate people. We live in a society first marked by a culture of individualism that says life is an individual journey. If you've ever seen that book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, that's about a solitary individual going through life with no attachments toward success. And that's the book people think is appropriate to give to college graduates. We have a society based on the lie, I can make myself happy. If I just have one more success, lose one more pound, do one more thing that's successful, I can make myself happy, and that is a lie. We can only give and receive happiness from each other. And then we amplify the individualism of our culture with our meritocracy. And the meritocracy is the most powerful cultural influence for a lot, thick tranches of our society. It gives you status markers to attach to so you don't have to think about who you actually are. It subliminally sends the message that those who are smarter and more accomplished are a little bit better than those who are less. It is a system based on conditional love, the idea that you can earn your way to affection. And so the meritocracy and individualism create a culture where we're buffered from each other. We prioritize choice over relationship, privacy over relationship, productivity over relationship. And this happens across the board. It happened to me. In 2013, I went into a ditch. We all have bad periods in my lives. Mine was in 2013. My marriage had ended. My kids had gone off to college. I'm a conservative, but my kind of conservatism isn't the prevailing kind of conservatism. And so a lot of my social life drifted away. And so I had long periods alone in an apartment with nobody to talk to. My weekends stretched on in vast expanses of solitude. I was in the best shape of my life because I would just run 8 miles every day to pass the time. If you had gone into my apartment in those days and you pulled open the drawer where there should have been silverware, there were Post-it notes. Where there should have been plates, there were envelopes and stationery, because my life had come down to just work. And workaholism is a surprisingly effective way to avoid any spiritual or emotional problem. But eventually you just crash through it. And I wandered through that period in a sort of permanent drunkenness. Not literal, just those sufferings when you become sort of unbounded. And I had a lot of social capital, a lot of financial resources, so I didn't go on opioids. I didn't actually contemplate suicide, but that was just because I was lucky. And as I was going through this process, a lot of Americans were also going through this process and are going through it today. I'm a very average person with above average communication skills. What happens to me generally happens to a lot of people. And so we are going through a crisis, like I was going through, a crisis of disconnection. 60% of Americans, or 35% of Americans over 45 say they're chronically lonely. 55% of Americans say no one knows them well. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious category is unaffiliated. Suicide rates are up 30% in the course of this century. Teenage suicides over the past 15 years are up 70%. 45,000 people kill themselves every year. 72,000 die of opiate addiction, and opiate addiction is just slow motion suicide. That's occasioned with a crisis of distrust. Used to be, if you asked people a generation ago, do you trust the institutions of your society? 75% said yes. Now it's 22. Do you trust the people around you? A generation ago, 60% said yes. Now it's 32% and 19% of millennials. The lower you get in the age distribution, the more distrusting people are. And as Bob Putnam of Harvard says, that's not perception, that's reality. It's because people are untrustworthy. And that's accompanied by a spiritual and moral crisis, which I think is at the root of all of our thing. I see it in my students. They graduate from college, they have a career setback, they fail by the measures of the meritocracy, and they crater. Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can endure any how. But if you don't know what your why is, when you have the setbacks, you crater, and that's what happens to a lot of my students. And that's sort of what's happened to our society. So I was in my valley, and I learned a few things. The first is, freedom sucks. Political freedom is pretty good. Economic freedom is okay. Social freedom sucks. The unrooted man is the adrift man. The unrooted man is the unremembered man because he's committed to nothing. Freedom is not an ocean we want to swim in. It's a river we want to get through so we can commit to something on the other side. The second thing I learned is when you're in a moment of suffering, you can either be broken or you can be broken open. We all know people who are broken by the bad things that happened in life. They've endured some kind of pain and grief, their ego has been attacked, and their first instinct is to cover up, make yourself invulnerable. Your life gets smaller, more afraid, lash out in anger, grievance, and resentment toward the world. As they say, pain that is not transformed gets transmitted. And we live in a society of tribalism, which is a broken response to suffering. Tribalism is a desperate attempt to create community, but not create community out of affection, but to create it out of hatred, mutual hatred. Tribalism is always zero-sum, scarcity mindset, us, them, friend, enemy, build walls, erect barriers. And it's tribalism is our bad attempt to create community, but out of hatred. And that's brokenness. Other people get broken open. Paul Tillich, the 1950s theologian, says what pain does is it reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. It carves through what you thought was the floor of the basement of your soul, and it carves through that floor and reveals a cavity below, and it carves through that and reveals a cavity below. And when you see deep into yourself, deeper into yourself than you even knew existed, then you realize that only emotional and spiritual food will fill those cavities. And so what I found, and what I think a lot of people find when they're broken open, is they come into contact with their heart, their desiring heart. And what the heart yearns for most of all is fusion with others, the kind of fusion that Louis de Bernier described in a book called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. In that novel, he's got an old guy talking to his wife, or talking to his daughter about his relationship with his late wife. And he says, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground, and when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found that we were one tree and not two. And you become aware of that yearning to fuse with another human being and with other people. The second thing you discover through this period is that you have a soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God. That's not my department. I do ask you to believe that there's some piece of you that has no shape, size, color, or weight, that is of infinite value and dignity. And that rich people don't have more of this and poor people old more than young. That slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of another person's soul. That rape is not just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, it's an attempt to obliterate another person's soul. And what this soul does is long for goodness. I've met a lot of people in the course of my journalism career, some of whom have done terrible things. I've never met anybody who didn't want to be good. And I've never met anybody whose life didn't fall apart when they couldn't point to some good their life was oriented toward, even if they were lying to themselves. And so when you get down to the bottom of yourself, you find that desires of the heart and the desires of the soul are the primary desires, not the desires of the ego. And that leads to the third realization, which is something I learned from Einstein, a quote from Einstein. The problem is not going to be solved at the same level of consciousness at which you created it. You have to create a different sense of consciousness to get out of the problem of disconnection and solitude. It had a marvelous quote about this. In the deeps are the violence and terror of which psychology has warned us. But if you ride these monsters deeper down, if you drop with them farther over the world's rim, you find what our sciences cannot locate or name, the substrate, the ocean or matrix or ether which buoys all the rest, which gives goodness its power for good and evil its power for evil, unified feel our complex and inexplicable caring for one another. And I just want to emphasize that last phrase, our inexplicable caring for one another. When the film of success, the moral numbness of the meritocracy, the buffered self of individualism gets swept away. You're left with that. And then you're willing to be rescued. And the thing I learned about for a society or for an individual, you can't pull yourself out of the valley. Somebody has to reach in and grab you out. And for me, it was a group that Dan Cardinali and I are part of. 5 years ago in 2013, 6 years ago now, I got invited over to somebody's house named Kathy and David in DC. And it was just a freak thing. At those days, I was taking every invitation I could get. And I went over, and Kathy and David had a kid in DC public schools, and that kid had their son had a friend whose mom had some health and drug issues, didn't have a place to live. So they said, can live with us. And then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. So the first day I went over to this house, there were 25 or 30 kids around the dinner table and 15 sleeping around the house. And I meet a kid by the front door, and I reach out my hand, I shake his hand, and he says, we really don't shake hands here. We hug here. And I'm not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but I've been hugging almost every Thursday in the 6 years since. And what these kids do is they demand good relationship. They have a complete intolerance for social distance. They want your love and care, and they want to give it to you. And their influence just changes who you are. And they reached down and they lifted me up. Bill Milliken, a friend of mine, says, he's been doing youth work, he's in his 70s. He said, I've been doing youth work all my life. I've never seen a program change a life. Only relationships change lives. And so AOK, which is this community, left me up. They are weavers, they're social weavers. There are weavers everywhere. And at our project, we go around the country and we find them everywhere. There's Aisha Butler, who was living in Englewood in Chicago. She was going to move out. The day that she was moving out, she saw two little girls playing across the street, an empty lot with broken bottles, and she said to her husband, we're not leaving that. We're not going to be just another family who left that. And she now creates RAGE, which is the big community organization. Ran to a woman named Sara Atkins in Ohio, rural Ohio. Her husband killed their kids and himself. She now runs free pharmacy, teaches nursing, foundation for moms who suffer violence. She says, I grew from this experience because I was angry. I was going to fight back against what he tried to do to me by making a difference in the world. See, he didn't kill me. My response is that whatever you meant to do to me, fuck you, you're not going to do it. The people, the weavers we met have a bright sadness. They've seen the shadow of the world, but they're bright about it. They're not, they have a moral motivation. They're not driven by a desire for status, power, money. They're driven by the desire to be in right relation with each other and to serve some transcendent good. They're somewheres, not anywheres. They planted themselves down. There was a guy I met in Youngstown. He just stood in the town square with a sign, Defend Youngstown. At the root, they're deeply relational. In a culture of individualism and meritocracy, they stand for relation. Okay, there's a great group called Becoming a Man, run by a woman named Mary Gordon, and what they do is they take infants and moms, put them on a green carpet in an 8th grade classroom, and have the kids put themselves in the mind of the infant. What are they thinking? It's an attempt to develop theory of mind. And there was one day when there was a kid named Darren who was bigger than everybody else because he'd been through the foster care system, had seen his mom murdered, and he'd been held back for 2 years, so he was really, should have been in 10th grade. He was big and a little scary looking. And he wanted to hold the baby. And the mom was a little nervous because he was scary. But she let him hold it, and he was great with the baby. He held it by the windowsill, nuzzled it in his chest, and gave it back and asked a series of questions about fatherhood. And his final question was, if nobody has ever loved you, do you think you can still be a good father? So what Mary Gordon is doing is she's reaching in and grabbing people like Darren is out. And that's what Weaver's doing. They're not just doing local good. They're culture change. They're rejecting the culture of individualism. They're rejecting the culture of the meritocracy. They stand for relationship. They were formed by relationship. We live for relationship. We precedes me. The problem with relationship is they happen slowly, and they take time, and they don't scale. But norms scale. If you can change the culture, you can change behavior. If you can change how people think they should live, then you can change the whole society. Social change when a small group of happens when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy them. That happened in the 1960s. It happened with the feminist movement. It happened with a lot of different movements. And so what Weave is about is trying to change the culture around the weavers who are already existing. There are millions of them. They're a movement that doesn't know they're a movement. So one of the things we try to do is lift them up so other people will be aware of them. The second thing we try to do is synthesize values. Because we would go to Red America, Nebraska, we were just in Nebraska, or New Orleans. They all use the same words. Deep mutuality. We're all equal here. We're all broken. Radical hospitality. The code of the neighbor. What is a neighbor supposed to do? And so we can spread those values. The third thing, most germane to people in this room, is how to create the infrastructure of a movement. We had a feminist movement when we had to fight gender inequality. We have an environmental movement to fight pollution. We have a social capital problem, a community problem, a community movement. We don't have the infrastructure of such a movement. What's an infrastructure of a movement require? Well, you need common stories. A movement is a group of people who share a common story. You need common projects. In the Bible, the book of Exodus, well, in the book of Genesis, the creation of the universe is covered in 9 verses. In Exodus, the creation of the tabernacle goes on for hundreds and hundreds of verses. Why is that? Because the Israelites need to be united into a people, and a people is a group of people who build something together. We need hubs, decentralized hubs like this gathering, like Dan's Upswell. Weave is having a gathering in May, gatherings that are linked to each other and part of one project. We need training academies. Meeting these weavers is like going to the nursing profession without nursing schools. They're just in it because they decide to do something. They have no way to actually get themselves trained. We need more organized donor networks. We need what the civil rights movement called soap opera every day, a series of little dramas to hold up to the world, and that's a better way to live. That's how we should all be living. We should all be inviting our neighbors over. What we're asking of America is for them to make a lifestyle choice that reflects a moral and spiritual choice. I wasn't like this 5 years. I didn't believe these things. But I went through a process, and now I do. And that may not be the process you all went through. Maybe most people in this room are naturally communal, but a lot of people are not. And a lot of people are not behaving the way we want neighbors to behave, and we just have to reset norms. And the final thing I'll say, it requires an ultimate shift in orientation. In the meritocracy and in our culture, we talk a lot about happiness. Happiness is when we win a victory for the self. You get a promotion, your team wins the Super Bowl, your self feels expanded. The better thing to shoot for is joy. If happiness is about the victory of the self, joy is about transcendence of the self. When you forget where you end and another person begins, where you end and your work begins, where you end and the community begins, when the ego begins to dissolve and you become enmeshed in something united. That's the sort of cultural change I hope we can see. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, David, for that wonderful address. My name is Lauren Smith, and I won the lottery in being able to moderate this panel. Although all the panels have been great, not to say that, but I'm very, very excited to be able to moderate this panel. One of the reasons that I was so excited is this idea of sort of the new localism and the connection, the interconnections that people have at the community level, something that resonates very deeply with me. I'm a pediatrician and former public health official, so for a couple decades I took care of children and families who I only saw in the hospital because the social fabric had either started to unweave or became frayed, or had altogether had a hole that they fell through. So this concept of how meaningful it is to have that social fabric really for those families and children, many of you all care and deeply about them as well, the weft and the warp of the social fabric is where they're located. So I really appreciate that. David, you just shared your reflections on the inexplicable caring for one another and that only relationships change lives. So I want to ask our our panel. So we're very thrilled to have Dan Cardinali from Independent Sector and Ann Stern from the Houston Endowment. I'd love to ask you all to respond to a question around power, because underneath what you were talking about, and as folks recall, we heard a lot yesterday around the issue of power. How would you all describe how philanthropy can avoid the pitfall of not recognizing the power that it brings to the kinds of weavers that you were talking about? And I'd love to be able to hear that. But before we address that, I want to let Dan and Ann give their remarks.
All right. Want to start?
Sure.
All right. First of all, I would start with a little bit of background about our foundation, Houston Endowment. We are a private foundation in Houston, and we have been there for over 80 years. So our roots are in Houston, our future is in Houston. And listening to David's comments, I think we are a neighbor with our fellow residents. In our 82-year history, we've evolved a lot, and we've evolved a lot in response to the region's changing needs and challenges. And I give a lot of credit to the foresight of our founder, Jesse Jones, who really did not name the foundation after himself and gave no mandate to how the investment was to be allocated across the community. He said, you know, I'm going to leave that to future generations to figure out what that looks like, and my, has our region changed over the past 80-something years. So today, if you think about our approach, the first thing I would say, and it's on our website, is Houston Endowment works with others across the nonprofit, public, and private sector to increase the vibrancy of the region and advance equity of opportunity. But it's all about, in addition to being deeply attuned to the needs of our community, it's really about creating connections. It's about fostering trust. It's about really connecting issues, because at the end of the day, the issues we deal with, healthcare, housing, immigration, education, they're all interrelated. The way they impact gets amplified sometimes. And there is no way that we will drive meaningful change on the issues we care about if we're working by ourselves and if we're coming up with the solutions by ourselves. So with $1.8 million in assets and about $80 million a year deployed into the community, I would say by far the most value that we have is the reputational asset, the reputational capital, the relationships with people, the deep community engagement, the ability to access to people who really understand their communities and have the better ideas about solutions than we ever would. And that is lots of potential in that. So the region itself is complicated. It's the fourth largest city, 9 neighboring counties, all one of the fastest growing regions in the country, and incredibly diverse. We are almost equally split in our population between Anglo, Black, Latino, and Asian. And we have 1 out of 4 of our residents is foreign born, with 33% of those being undocumented. So one of the results is a quilt of really interesting neighborhoods, each with a distinct culture, each with distinct assets and challenges. And yet what we also have, and I'm a native Houstonian who really prides myself in getting to live in a welcoming city where you're not asked who your father is, and yet we have this deep socioeconomic disparity and growing income disparity and growing disparity of opportunity. And so 4 years ago, when we codified the foundation's mission after almost 80 years, we decided it was time. We called out the vibrancy of the city, but we called out a commitment to change equity of opportunity, to build on it, to remove barriers to it. Because how in the world can you have vibrancy without having equity of opportunity? And it really links back to our founder, Jesse Jones, who believed, I will not be successful unless everyone in this community thrives. And he really recognized, even back 80 years ago, the interconnectedness of his world with the world of the other people of the region. So the role of Houston Endowment changes depending on the opportunity. We have relationships, we have trust. We don't have a lot of expert knowledge, but we know people who do have that expert knowledge. And I would say that as a perpetual institution, we just have to keep pushing ourselves to use our reputational assets, to bring people together, to convene them, to use our voice, to take on controversial topics. And a lot of times we work with people and we have conflicts. And they're our neighbors, and we will work with them again. And so it it brings a real, you have to bring maturity to the process. You have to bring a real listening to the process and understand that even if you feel an urgency and a resolve and a strength of a conviction that you are driving the right thing, that sometimes you have to wait until everyone's ready to come along. So it's that lovely balance between pushing with urgency and listening and respecting it and appreciating where everybody else is coming from. So I'll mention, take a few minutes to mention a couple of the issues that we're working on right now, and I won't go into great detail, but happy to talk about these during the Q&A or at lunch afterwards, or even in the weeks to come. But I would say the common denominator in our work is not one of these initiatives came to us as a grant application, not one of them. They came about because we had program officers who were engaged in the community, who were listening, who were convening people, who were letting ideas develop among the people who know these issues best. And the other thing is that every single one of them involves multiple players across multiple sectors. So that's the common denominator. I have to mention education because when you focus on equity of opportunity, how do you not focus on strengthening the public education system? So we've done a lot of work. It's been slow going. We have state policy that is not very supportive of what we're trying to do. And we also have a very dysfunctional, the largest school system in our region is incredibly dysfunctional right now, sad to say. But that doesn't mean we can wait until the policy aligns. And so we have over 60 organizations who have come together. We've incubated a nonprofit to really lead the establishment by this group of a common vision for the community, which is every child in every neighborhood should have access to a high quality public education. There are specific strategies, there are specific metrics, there are specific goals, and it's going to be really hard work, but it's one thing that our foundation can help do is provide the cover for some of the difficult change that needs to happen and keep that vision in the collective consciousness. Immigrants are obviously a huge part of our community. They drive our economy. Without them, we would not be this vibrant economy that we have been over the last 20 years. In 2016, we convened a group of legal service providers to immigrants to really think about how do we prepare for the expected expansion of DACA and DAPA under the Obama administration. That work went on for a couple of years. The policy that emerged was very different than we expected it to be, but how lucky were we that these organizations had spent 2 years building capacity, connecting with each other to share best practices, and really reached out to the people in their communities, to the neighbors in their communities, and had become trusted advisors for those immigrants. They became vital, and we saw the strength and the power of those connections when Harvey hit, because it's hard to imagine a more vulnerable population during a disaster than this immigrant population, and especially the undocumented, who did not have access to many resources. So there was this collaborative in the shelters, providing a hotline, answering questions about what relief am I entitled to, and actually raising funds from some of our peer funders from across the country who said, we want to help Houston, and we particularly want to help this population. And so those who had sometimes access to no other relief had relief through this coalition that developed. Really the value of trust and connections. That led to more active work in civic engagement, and that work has been going on for about 6 months and is really proceeding beyond our wildest expectations. The city and the county have come together and said, let's build on some of this trust that developed through this immigrant coalition, and let's try to really focus on how we don't get a significant undercount during the 2020 census. And so instead of sending whoever the census taker is out into these communities, they are identifying community leaders, they are certifying them as census takers, they are sending them door to door among people that they trust, and the hope is that that we get an accurate census count. This group is also doing a civic health survey. One of the first things they noted was that there is a very low level of trust relative to other cities in Houston, Texas, and so there are actually strategies around that. I think it's not to be surprising when you consider there's not a reason for trust in many of these communities, but how do we build on that? And finally, I would mention a hyper-local example of this work. So there are obviously neighborhoods in Houston that more than any others are significantly impacted by some of the challenges that are associated with lack of opportunity. And so we went in with another foundation about 3 years ago to a community with no other expectation than there was a group of citizens who wanted to to lead their organization through economic revitalization, and they wanted to do it themselves, and they wanted to do it before the community became completely gentrified. So we went in, funded technical support for their conversations and their strategic planning, and we said, we're here, we're interested in what you come up with and the solutions that you identify, and we'd love to be part of that. It was a real leap of faith for us. It required for people who like to control things. It was very difficult to go in with no other idea rather than to learn what was possible. And that has led to incredible work by this community group, and for us, the identification of a historic black hospital that had been fallen into bankruptcy, and we were able to help return it to the community and provide jobs, and also provide an expansion of mental and behavioral health services for that community. So closing, localism is powerful. I think when you work in one geographic region, you get to develop relations, build on it for the next time. Every time we come together around an issue, there is more power, I think, from trust from the last experience and the relationships that exist. But I would also say that we are affected by what happens at the state and national level. So as positive as it can be locally, we can't forget that those headwinds can actually undo the work that we're doing locally, and so that has to be continuously a prong of the work that we do, is focusing on how do we enhance the support of the state and national policy to really serve the work that's going on locally.
Thank you, Ann. That was awesome. And the way that you connected the relationship building that you did precisely to the changes that you were making really did jive with what David was saying. So
I want to make sure we get a chance to engage with you all. So I'm going to cut to a couple of just key ideas. First, just a personal thing that David mentioned in his talk, a guy by the name of Bill Milliken, and I had the privilege of working with Bill for about 18 years. And it is very true, he came up with this very profound insight that it really wasn't programmatic initiatives that changed kids. It was loving relationships in service of really good programs. And I think that is the challenge all of us face every day. How do we retain the science and the expertise and the wisdom, both at the local and national level, and imbue it with a kind of first-order commitment to the unfolding of individual human flourishing and collective human flourishing? And that then leads to a kind of social change that can address Lauren's question around the right use of power, the right deployment of resources, so that there is a collective unfolding of human flourishing. So I think that's our adaptive challenge as we step into this moment. So how did I get there, and what are we doing about that? So I watched, when I was in my prior life at communities and schools, lots of people of extraordinarily goodwill trying to help young people, and they were confronting a set of systems, public education, that wasn't always willing to engage and was more kind of focused on its institutionality. And over a 40-year period, I watched civil society, nonprofits, organize themselves with business and government and philanthropy and partner with public education to begin to innovate together a way that could mitigate the effects of poverty, of trauma, in high-poverty schools and in kids' and families' lives in a way that public education, a trust, a commitment we make across the country, could better serve all young people equitably. So it wasn't just government, it wasn't just philanthropy, it wasn't just business or nonprofits. It was the collective work of remaining hyper-focused on love as a transformative force and using science to be able to then continually refine how to do that well every day and at scale, up to about 1.5 million students. So when I stepped into this job at Independent Sector, I looked across and saw 1.8 million civil society organizations, mostly nonprofits, many philanthropic institutions, employing 14 million Americans, third largest workforce in America, leveraging $650 billion of tax revenue and wages, leveraging $410 billion of philanthropic giving every year, mobilizing 63 million volunteers, doing things as vast and diverse as you can possibly imagine. And yet we are living in a moment where we feel, as David so beautifully articulated, the fabric, the very sense of our human connectedness pulling ourselves apart. So is it that we're not telling the right story? Is it that those institutions have somehow become victims of a cultural narrative and now are replicating the unhealthy practices? How do we catalyze a set of conversations and change our behavior such that that amazing crown jewel in the world, civil society in the US, can consciously take up this work where the human person is at the center of activity, and then we leverage all the extraordinary assets, the human and financial and collective wisdom, against human flourishing. So Independent Sector was created 40 years ago as a classic membership organization. Today, we're about 450 members, and so I'm going to take you through a little bit of a risky story. But when I took the job almost 3 years ago, I looked at our membership. We are 450 members, the large philanthropic and nonprofit organizations. We are the only organization in the United States that are sector spanning. We have grant seeking, grant making, corporate philanthropy. We partner with business. And we were routinely representing what was healthy civil society in America. And if you actually looked at the individuals who were making those determinations, it was 30 to 40 people who sat through a membership committee that then kind of named what the public policy issues would be and determined what our conference would be. And we were routinely standing and proclaiming that we had our fingers in the pulse beat of American civil society, when honestly it was the furthest thing from the truth. So we had an adaptive challenge to say, how is it that we are charged with this leadership opportunity, power, and yet we have so abdicated our responsibility to connect a community? So what we did is we blew up what was our normal conference, and we said, no longer are we going to go with the sage on the stage, which is perfectly acceptable in some designs, not for us. And how do we initiate a continuous engagement process whereby the meaning-making of what is important to civil society can be top-down and bottom-up? That those two sit in a way in which power is mediated such that what's going on in civil society gets named, and that then informs our public policy work. And we have a formidable public policy initiative. So we redesigned our conference. We blew up the Independent Sector Conference, and we renamed it to be Upswell, which is collectively owned by civil society. It is a platform whereby community-based leaders, national leaders can come together in the most non-transactional way to engage with each other around what are the important issues of our day. So that sounds great. How do you do that? That's the adaptive challenge. So we have 3 elements. One, we are hyper community focused. Where we're going to be holding the conference uses that community's collective wisdom through civil society as the case study. So it is locally grounded issues that are raised to national import. So we literally hire community organizers in the communities in which we're going to operate and have them work across a wide range of civil society organizations to determine what is going on. And then we use the wisdom of these large actors that are members of ours to say, what are some of the tensions we're seeing locally that are relevant nationally? Number one. Number two is we create social collision. So power. Lauren mentioned power at the very beginning. Power, in my mind, is a perfectly fine thing. It's a tool and a resource. Who the individuals, the human person, their disposition to using power is what matters. So we design Upswell so that it is actually a way in which people can come together and be in relationship in a way that is non-transactional and new. I'll give you an example. We were in a pop-up arts studio in Detroit where Darren Walker sat with a guy who runs a homeless shelter in Traverse City, Michigan. They would never have had an opportunity to connect. And that conversation then generated a set of learning for all of us involved that influenced how Upswell unfolds for the future, how both Darren and this leader now do their work. And finally, skill building. As I mentioned at the very beginning, leveraging, accelerating, scaling love through science and programmatic work is not for the faint of heart. Those 14 million employees, those 63 million volunteers are hungry for skills and technical expertise to drive their work into community transformation. So we embarked on this process, and last year we had 1,500 folks, the vast majority of whom were folks of color from the community. Philanthropy played a critically powerful role in democratizing access to that meaning-making. And we are in this grand experiment. The hope, finally, I will say, is that Upswell, over time, reauthorizes independent sector's public policy voice from the 30 to 40 people that were determining the public policy agenda to now tens of thousands, ideally millions of folks, and that through this engagement process, we determine what are the real obstacles and opportunities facing civil society, and how does a national organization, an infrastructure organization, leverage that voice to help facilitate and create social change.
Wow. Well, that was an amazing sort of overview of how you came to craft Upswell. And so I guess I would love to use that as an opportunity to then jump into some questions with the panel, because I know that you have a lot more that you want to share. You knit back to the question around power, so I want to sort of come back to that, since that was such an important theme from yesterday, and it does seem to be included in what each of you have said. So I was wondering if you could each take a moment and think about, share with us how you thought about the sharing of power, how authentically engage with community, and by authentic I mean actually being willing to sort of share and cede power. I think you brought that up, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, I think foundations do have a certain type of power, and I think if we try to pretend that we don't, that's not very authentic, and we actually give up one of the tools that we have to drive social change. So I think acknowledge the fact that you do have power and use it as a force for good. That being said, make sure that everything you do is grounded in community engagement, and let community inform and start to both inform the identification of the problem and the crafting of the solution. And so I think it's just you sort of feel your way along. It's both the bottoms-up power and it's the top-down power, and use it. It'll vary by situation, but I think everything that you do, I think we spend a lot of time internally talking about how important it is to remember what it feels like when a foundation walks into a room. And one of the things that we're working on right now is moving our headquarters, moving our office space. We're on the 64th floor of an office building, and it became really apparent what it feels like when you're out of the community and you take 3 elevators and an escalator to get from the parking garage downtown onto the 64th floor of an office building. It doesn't matter what we say when you get there. The message has already been sent. And so we have bought land and are building a building that will be not only transparent, we're hoping for a lot of glass, and accessible, but also a place where the community feels comfortable bringing members to convene. So I think there are a lot of different ways that you have to think about the messages that you're sending, and how do you create those connections with people where everybody can play their highest and best role.
Thank you, David.
I guess my theory of power, first of all, it rests in a theory of social change. So how's the society going to change? To me, we're in a moment like the 1890s. We have a big economic transition, lots of immigration, decay of the social fabric. And in that era, change happened in 3 phases. First, there was a cultural shift from social Darwinism to the social gospel movement, from a very individualistic movement to a more communal. Second, there was a civic renaissance. In the 1890s, you had the creation of the Boys and Girl Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Settlement House movement, the environmental movement, the NAACP. You had all these things grew up within 5 years of each other. And then third, they created the progressive movement. So when culture, civic, politics. And so to me, the most important parts of power at in our stage of transition are cultural and civic. And so how do you create that power? One of the things it emphasizes power, especially cultural power and civic power, are not zero-sum. They're created. And my professors, my mentors on this are Peter Block and John McKnight, which is that power is created when you create a new conversation. When you gather a new group of people together, including those who you formerly defined as the problem, you've created power. And if you create a collective impact structure, you've created power. And to me, the great tragedy of our moment is that we in this room don't have a common identity. We are letting power slip through our fingers every day because we're involved in parallel play. And if you created a common identity and a common movement, that would be an act of power because other people would be forced to reckon with this thing, this entity. But we don't do that because we're busy with our own projects. And that, to me, is a tragedy.
So can I build off of that? So I agree with David very much, and we've had multiple conversations of this. So let's get very brass tacks about what this might look like. So all of you who run philanthropic institutions, all of you who run nonprofits, I'm guessing the vast majority have theories of change. And I would venture a guess that much of your theory of change was probably driven by getting the smartest consulting firms and some of the, it's all good, it's all good. And the smartest academics to come up with what the Lit Review has told you to be the most effective multi-pronged strategy to move forward. And in there, hopefully now, is a box somewhere around community engagement. And for some of the more enlightened ones, it cuts across, right, a bunch of theories of change. So it's an activity within a beautifully architected, with multiple slides, theories of change. And then we go out to community, and even though the engagement is how we're supposed to do it, it's still kind of this contractor relationship. Like, oh, right, I need you to eventually have the aha that this is what you need to do, and then we'll be able to collectively move in this direction. So I just wonder is if we have not idolized to the point the theories of change, and we live behind a technical competency around community engagement, which actually isn't about sharing power. So how radical is it if we're thinking seriously about meaning-making, culture change, where we begin to co-design our theories of change, literally our theories of change, around the rate at which community can metabolize social change, and that the collective wisdom of community married with the collective power of money and expertise. I led with the story around communities and schools for a reason. I believe science and expertise matters immensely. I just think we have so absolutized it, and these pristine, very wonderful ways our ideas can go so far in front of our ability to actually implement and engage with people and the messiness of that. And then we're pressured by our boards or by our corporate social return on investment, where we feel this need to just push so hard that we're performatorily contradicting our desire to share power by virtue of these structures we've put in place. So I would just challenge us to incrementally or dramatically reevaluate how we construct our theory of change, who gets to be in the co-design, that we don't go from one guardrail to the other. Like, oh, community wisdom is the only answer. I ran a network for many years, and there are really bad ideas that folks simply don't know because they haven't had the opportunity to be exposed to some of the best science. Once they are, and they can get it, they make really good decisions that tend to be highly practical. It's slow and messy. So that would be the challenge I would put forth for us if we're really thinking about power and community change and creating conversations that lead to cultural change. Let's kind of walk the talk.
So I want to follow up on that piece around trust. And David, you talked about, and all of you have talked about the need for collaboration across sectors. And yesterday we heard quite a bit about the eroding trust that people have in the institutions that would likely need to be participating in those collaborations. So I'm wondering if you could just share a moment about how you're thinking about the twin responsibility of rebuilding trust and relationship at the same time when the institutions themselves may not have that, as you put it, social capital to be able to invest. So.
Well, one thing I'd say is I think this is where local foundations have a real edge, because, I mean, what I would hope is that if there are questions or challenges about how we're approaching our work, that we would hear it from our neighbors and partners. And I think trust ultimately comes down to relationships and personal relationships. And so I can't trust an institution until I can trust the people that I know with that institution, and I understand who they are and where they're coming from. So I think we have a real edge being a local foundation.
Yeah. At Weave, we spent a year traveling around the country, I don't know, to 42 states, visiting community weavers all around. And one of the questions I would ask at the dinners was, at what level of society are you most attached? Is it your street, your neighborhood, your town, your state, your nation, or the world? And 5% would say the world. I love all humanity. 95% would say my town. The town is the mutual affection that they're willing to die for, the guy with the Defend Youngstown. And so you can build trust around a common affection. And then I think that's buttressed by the work of Raj Chetty and Eric Kleinenberg and all the rest, that the neighborhood is the unit of change. That I used to think individuals were the unit of change, but as my friend Mac McCarter, who runs something called Community Renewal International, says, you can't only clean your part of the swimming pool. You have to clean the whole pool that people live in, because we're so influenced by contagions and norms. And so when you think the neighborhood is the unit of change, then you realize, well, where is power resting in the neighborhood? How is the neighborhood getting together? Who's setting the norms? Are you creating platforms where the neighborhood can get together? This is Kleinenberg's research on libraries. So that local level is where people actually already have pre-existing levels of trust. And there's a passage in the book of Job with the phrase I love, and the sparks fly upward. And that's where the local has to start. The trust is not going to be built on the national level. I live in Washington, D.C., believe me. It's going to come up from the neighborhood, and then it'll grow up through a cultural contagion.
The only thing I'd add is I think institutions still are alive and well in our lives. If you think of just how many hit the people we know and love, and so the question then becomes, I agree that I think through relationship is where trust is built, but there is something, David talked about his own personal journey. When you hit the rocks, you are at a crossroad. You can go into despair, or you're opened up, you're kind of awoken, and you can step into something. I think institutions facilitate the catching of people when that awakening happens. So what are the sets of competencies that aren't about the best Excel street or your Microsoft skills? It's about the culture you build in your institutions that enable people to catch that moment when someone's I remember this woman in our independent sector, her bike was stolen. This is her sole form of transportation. And within, I don't know, an hour, there had been a GoFundMe, and we had gotten her resources for her bike. It was one of those moments where a crisis facilitated a culture, and the culture stepped into a constructive way to respond to someone not out there in the building. So I think that's a terrific opportunity. I just believe institutions really matter, and trust building is a skill set that we can all cultivate every day.
Wonderful. Well, I know our time is winding down, but I wanted to give each of you an opportunity for one last parting thought. In particular for this audience, what would you have them leave with in thinking about this new localism? So Anne's had it to start, so I'm going to pick on you, Dan.
Well, the fact that this is on the agenda is extraordinarily exciting to me, that there is an openness to not abdicate the power and the institutional nature at the national level, but a groundedness in what is going on in community. And my only hope is that we're prompted by the pace of community change in the way we work across our institutions, and that we can be powerful and smart in our national focus around cultural change.
I would say, go back to something Dan said about just being really skeptical about relying only on theories of change and the science of this. There's so much around the trust and the connectedness, and I think we all seek scalability, and to recognize that scalability with social issues looks somewhat different, and that you have to be so mindful of context, and you can learn from each other and should learn from each other, but everything, it all comes down to the local context and the relationships and trust of the people that are working together.
Yeah, in my lane, as I've emphasized, is cultural change. We seek to drive cultural change around the weaver lifestyle, the values, the creed, the gospel, the way of living, and we want more people to live that way. And if anybody knows how to do cultural change, which is a mysterious thing, write to me at david.brooks@aspeninstitute.org, which actually goes to my phone, david.brooks@aspeninstitute.org. We just somehow have to do it through partnership.
Wonderful. I will close in saying that in hearing all of you speak, I thought of two individuals who are probably never referred to in the same sentence, which is John Donne and Marian Wright Edelman. For the first one, I think about no man is an island. We can update it. No person is an island unto himself. All are part of the continent, part of the main, and I think that really speaks to around your individualism, the woes of individualism. And then Marian Wright Edelman wrote or spoke, service is the rent we pay for living. And that idea of that service, that interconnected service that you all have been talking about really resonated with me. So thank you so much. Can we give our panel a round of applause?